Okay. All right. Hello, everyone. Um, my name is Camilo Otero, and I'm the Artist Programs Manager at Center for Book Arts. I am also part of the organizing committee of the 2024 Contemporary Artist Books Conference. We ask participants to keep their microphones off at all times during the presentation. I also wanted to let everyone know that the session is going to be recorded. It's actually recording in this moment. So if you want your likeness, you don't want your likeness in the recording, you may turn your cameras off now. And I will begin the presentation. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Center for Book Arts for their support in organizing CABC, as well as our additional sponsors, Deirdre Lawrence, longtime supporter of CABC, and the Grolier Club. The title of this year's conference is Artist Books as Expanded Literacy. Through the various panels and sessions over the last 2 days, we have and will continue to explore this question. How can artists' books expand upon ideas of information and visual literacy, conceptions of language, data visualization, methods of presenting research, and beyond? This panel today will specifically discuss the intersection of artist books and literature. I will start by introducing our three panelists, and then each one will give their presentations for about 20 to 25 minutes. After that, I will moderate a Q&A portion, so feel free to add your questions to the chat at any point during the presentations, and I will read them out loud to the panelists at the end. Our first presenter is Gretel Acosta. I'm going to spotlight Gretel right now. Gretel Acosta is a Latin American modern arts instructor and PhD candidate in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at Tulane University. Her academic endeavors center on Latin American and contemporary literature and visual arts, encompassing research, curatorial work, and writing. Currently, her doctoral dissertation delves into the influence of literature's growing integration within contemporary art, as well as the portrayal of contemporary art themes in Latin American and Latinx narrative fiction. With an MA in Languages, Literatures, and Cultures from the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, her academic foundation was laid with a bachelor's degree in art history from the University of Havana in Cuba. Her scholarly contributions, including peer-reviewed articles and book chapters, span explorations of creacionismo in avant-garde movements and pioneer Latin American contributions to conceptualism, to editorial projects by artists. Our second presenter, I'm going to present you all first, is Daniel Mellis. Daniel Mellis makes artist books and other text-based artworks on such topics as poetry of philosophy, the phenomenology of space, the built environment, and the law. Experimental letterpress and offset printing underpins much of his work. His work has been shown internationally, including at the Gagosian Gallery in New York, and is in many collections worldwide. He received his MFA from Columbia College Chicago and has degrees in mathematics from the University of Chicago and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Our third presenter is Dr. Agnieszka Szukowska, an assistant professor at the Department of Performing Arts at the Institute of English and American Studies, the University of Gdansk in Poland, A literary scholar and art historian, she specializes in early modern festival culture and the intersections of theater and visual arts. She has co-edited with John Ward and Maria Fengler on time essays in honor of Professor Jerzy Limon, among others. Her recent publications focus on the Stuart Court Masque, early modern occasional architecture, and Shakespeare in contemporary art. So I am going to hand it off to Gretel. Welcome, Gretel, and thank you for being here.
Thank you for your presentation, Camilo, and it's an honor to be here with all of you. I'm gonna try to share my screen. It's full size. Okay, as Camilo says, I'm an art historian, a Latin American art history instructor, and also doing my doctoral studies in Spanish and Portuguese literature. But this blend of art and languages have been the central focus of my career since my undergrad studies in art history, where I wrote my dissertation on conceptual Cuban art. Building on that research, I curated my first exhibition titled Neno, a smart format exhibition in 2015. Departing from the ubiquitous themes of conceptualism, I used the notion of physical smartness as a catalyst for works with significant narrative and temporal dimensions. For the subsequent edition of Nano, with the addition of the curator Gladys Garrote to the project, we expand the scope to include non-artistic expressions, such as short films, microhistory lectures, and mini history context via SMS. Initially, my research focus was on object-based art that used writing as a conceptual tool, writing to think rather than to read, close to what Dworkin described as conceptual writing, and Goldsmith as uncreative writing. However, now in my doctoral studies, I have shifted the focus toward the use of fiction as a medium for artistic creation. I now explore artworks that engage audiences primarily through readings. They are to be read. The summary of my more or less work interest could somehow be summarized as from the conceptual term to the narrative term. My current research is situating within the growing present and consolidation of artist writing, which have been described as discursive term by Maria Fusco, the literary term by Brian Dillon, and narrative term by David Marotto. I'm examining Latin American and Latinx visual artists who use fiction or narrative literary forms, such as short stories and other type of fictional texts, as medium in their artistic practices. They produce literary texts that engage with the context of contemporary art. But additionally, I have gathered a group of writers who use the contemporary art world as a setting and topic in their novels and short stories. In the selected texts of this author, we find the fictional recreation of contemporary art contexts within which they create artworks that exist by virtue of the narrative articulation. I'm interested in shifting the emphasis from the identities, artistic or literary, associated with the creators, to the functionality of the text and their challenging effects within the context of contemporary art and literature. I studied these intersections in two scenarios. Narrative fiction works conceived as artworks associated with the real context of contemporary art, such as museums or galleries, and narrative fiction works that visually create contemporary artworks, such as installation, performance, etc., and recreate the art context in which these artworks exist. The vast majority of the books that I study are regular fiction books that do not appear different from typical literary publications. A constant element in both classification is the art context. This contextualization is achieved by either bringing the book into the space identified as artistic or by the primary identification of the creator as an artist, like what the keynote speaker Claudia de la Torres said during her presentation. An artist book is a book made by an artist. But another way in which these words are contextualized, particularly by writers, is by fictionally creating this context within the books, using the figure of the artist, events, or situation of contemporary art, also the collector. Fabio Casero is a prominent contemporary artist in Argentina since the 90s, but he's also the author of 3 books. Casero published with Mansalva, an editorial focused on literature that has supported his work. The role of the director of Mansalva, Francisco Aramona, editor of Casero's book, but also the curator of his latest show, has been essential in the development and the promotion of Casero also as a writer. This is not an specialized editorial, which allows Casero's book to have regular circulation in bookstore at an accessible price. Last summer, I had the opportunity to interview Casero. When I asked him about his entry into literature, he replied, and I cite, "On one hand, literature seems to me to be the apex of conceptual art. And on the other hand, I arrived at it through neme bias, like by imitation, as doing something that resembled something else, in this case, typing. I arrived at literature like a parrot that, imitating speech, actually learned to speak." I'm interested in promoting a reading of Casero's work as a continuum where he practiced contemporary art as fiction and literary fiction as contemporary art, and as a kind of model, reading model that I'm interested in practicing with other artists/writers. At his retrospective personal exhibition at the Museo de Arte Moderno, Mamba, Neme Bias was the opening piece. Neme Bias is a work in progress of creating words, signifying without any meaning. Originally written, or rather being written in Excel, it has various formats. It's a limited edition artist book, video, soundtrack, and installation. Installing Neme Bias across the first room in the exhibition, Casero made it mandatory to traverse it to access the exhibition. Although it is a word that can be explored or browse, in its book version, it is not necessarily intended to be read in the traditional sense, and almost impossible to be completely read. On the other hand, at the word that closed the exhibition walkthrough, Casero presents a reading room with comfortable armchairs and copies of the short book Salisbury that he had published a year before. In addition to establish a sort of curatorial walkthrough, the placement of the first and the last works importantly highlight the differences in the type of reception these works anticipate from the audience. In my reading of Salisbury, I explored the book as a literary book that circulates in the traditional bookstore system, but also in relation with other works in the exhibition, focusing on the connection between the fictional content of the stories and the themes and technique present in other works, including videos, objects, and installation. We have, for example, the present. This is the book that he presents, the copies to be reading. An example of this connection is the presence of snow in unexpected places, like in his installation Nieve Indoor Snow. but this transcends the boundaries of physical installation. As a recurring thematic motif in his stories, Snow embodies a convergence of several key elements in his creative process. Perceptive confusion, the melting of ordinary with the extraordinary, and crucially, time, challenging the notion of a linear temporality and evoking a sense of temporal suspension. In literature, this narrative connection between texts echoes the constructive paradigm of seriality. The book Salisbury unfolds in a series of themes that reappear from different perspectives, dividing and combining in multiple ways. In his latest book, Antología del Sueño Argentino, or Anthology of the Argentine Dream, the recurrences are even more complex, and the stories are untitled, simply numerated. In his 2022 exhibition titled the Chapel of the Ghost, or the Ghost Chapel, El Campeón de los Fantasmas, the title is presented as an enigma that has to be solved through the reading of Anthology of the Argentine Dream. But also literature plays a crucial role in one of the exhibition pieces, the Miller monochrome. These pieces comprise a very old-looking pin painting accompanied by an 8-page booklet that tell the story of a 19th century miller who heard the voices of 5 ghosts. Each ghost used him as a vessel to paint in their own distinctive style. The character described what he did for each spirit, which he didn't consider as painting at the beginning, since no recognizable figures were present. For instance, he described, and I translate, the style of the spirit on Tuesday involved painting straight black lines, both horizontal and vertical, from one end to the canvas to the other. Some rectangular forms by intersecting lines were filled with pure, unmixed colors, blue, red, and yellow. Reader familiar with visual arts might deduce which artists are ghosts represent each day. However, in Casero typical style, the connection between the description and artistic style is ambiguous, and more than one modern artist could correspond to these descriptions. The names I propose following the verbal descriptions are Monday, Kandinsky, Tuesday, Mondrian, Wednesday, Franklin, Thursday, Jackson Pollock, and Friday, Matt Rocco, significantly charting a mainstream historiographic line of the development of abstraction. Right? When the miller's wife burned down the workshop, only a small pink monochromatic painting survived, like the one that we have on the wall. After reading, we realized that we are in the presence of an abstract painting from the 1700s, an impossibility in the linear narrative of Western art history, yet a reality made possible through the fictive fact. I would like to acknowledge the significant precursors in this field, such as David Marotto's work, especially his book, The Artist's Novel, and the project, The Book Lovers, developed with the curator Johanna Zielinska. This project centers on the artist's novel as a medium within the visual art. Although the artists I study primarily write short stories, not full-length novels, and these fictions are not necessarily arise as a part of an exhibition project, as Marotto's defend. A central element of his project is the idea of the artist's fantasy about writing a novel. Also, Marotto suggests that literary concepts such as fiction, narrative, imagination, and identification offer visual artists a vast field of creative possibilities. And what I found profoundly interesting is that, coincidentally, writers and literary scholars in Latin America have been highlighting the creative possibilities that contemporary art offers for literature, and also the writer's fantasy with the spaces and action of the visual artists. Like in his essay on contemporary art, the renowned writer César Aira writes about transitioning from his fascination with the figure and tradition of the writer to contemporary art, attributing to himself and to literature the capability of being an expanded reproduction of the work of art. Juan Cárdenas speaks in another essay, the writer Juan Cárdenas, about his writing as trapped in a territory that he defines as, and I'm quoting, literature that wants to be art and art that wants to be literature. The literary critic and writer Reinaldo Ladaga, in his book Spectacle of Reality, knows how a segment of current Latin American literature is inspired by artist processes like immediacy and performance, indicating a growing presence. And the writer and curator Iván de la Nuez used the term art fiction, while Ladaga used terms as verbal fiction and verbal arts. An example of a writing drawing from contemporary art can be found in Roque Larraquí's La Come Madre. Oh, I didn't show you the monochromes, the Miller's monochrome. So in Larraquí's novel, the premise of a human head separated from the body, with the premise that a human head separated from the body remains alive and conscious for 9 seconds, led the doctors at an early 20th century sanatorium to create a remarkable installation. 12 guillotines arranged in circles were used to construct a sentence in contact with afterlife through successive beheadings. This voluntary donation of life to science is mirrored in the second part of the novel, set in 2009, where it is replicated as voluntary donation of life to contemporary art. Narrated in the first person by an artist, these medical instruments became aesthetic objects, but the material remained the same, the human body. In Ornamento, now a novel by Juan Cárdenas, the relationship between scientists and artists merged into the art. I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah, we continue. I get something with the audio. So this relationship between the scientist and artist merged into the artistic self-awareness of the scientist narrator, who is married to a visual artist, who assets his creating an artistic signature over the effects of a sexual drug as a kind of happening of social sculpture or bio-art. In the novel La muerte de un instalador by Álvaro Enrique, the corpse of an installation artist is displayed in a gallery. His death was a long-term artistic process created by the collector. In La maldita pintura by Elton Manjarres, 2 women are exhibited, an anthropologist and a photographer, naked, locked in a cage at the Tate London. In addition to a certain critical stance toward the eccentricities of contemporary art, this novel that I select developed artistic proposals that share the use of the human body as material for intervention, installations, and artistic exhibitions. The complexity of visual representation of violence is undoubtedly something that they explore and elements that interested them. We have gradual killings, intervention of human bodies, the creation of enormous and destructive artworks, and even the exhibition of corpus that demonstrate the potential of literary fiction to create complex artworks, and especially those with intricate, complex, material, procedural, and ethical aspects. If we consider the fictional condition of the contemporary art system, that's it. The creation of alternative worlds, hypothetical scenarios, and parallel reality. and the centrality of the narrative around the artworks. It's a narrative that could be written or not, but also the increasing presence of visual artists who directly employ literature as a central medium in their artistic practice. We can justify considering performances, sculptures, intervention, and installation developed by writers within stories and novels as rightful artistic propositions. And I still have more questions that answer in these projects, but some of the ones that interesting me most, and which I would like to share with you for the Q&A, but also for the future are: what accounts for the persistence of the book in its more traditional form among artists, but also among writers who transition into the realms of art? How can interdisciplinary collaboration be developed between visual artists and writers who foster richer narrative layer within artworks without forcing it? How could I transform the defense of this doctoral research into an art exhibition? Related to that, how to activate the artistic components of books that are not limited edition or visually distinct from typical literary publications. Thank you so much. I'm gonna stop sharing.
Thank you, Gretel. Now I am going to spotlight Daniel. Welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you for the organizers and the sponsors for giving this opportunity. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So today, I'm going to be talking about the book Tango by Vasily Kamensky and Tango with Cows, the translation of it that I produced in collaboration with Eugene Ostashevsky. How the process of translating it led me to deeper insights into its production and design, and what possibilities exist for alternative and more creative approaches to its translation. So Tango with Cows by Vasily Kamensky is one of the classic books of Russian Futurism. It was printed in early 1914 on the back of a 5-color floral wallpaper and had the top right corner cut off. It's a relatively slim book of only 18 leaves with 12 poems and 3 illustrations. Every poem, as well as the cover and advertising page, have a prominent visual form created entirely with typography, and the 6 ferroconcrete poems dispense with linear order and explore the spatial possibilities of the printed page. So here, let me show you the book. So I'm going to show some images of the Getty's copy so you get a sense of its materiality, but also individual pages paired with our translation. And so for this presentation, I've digitally superimposed the translation on the Getty's copy just to make it easier to compare, but the actual translation was printed on reconstructed wallpaper, and you'll see that later. So most of the poems are about what was then modernity, technology, or city life. There are poems about aviation. So this is Kamensky's flight over Warsaw. He was the first poet aviator, although his airplane career lasted only like a year until he crashed into a Polish swamp. There's poems about the telephone. So this is a sort of disjointed telephone conversation. So you can see the Russian on the left and the English on the right. There's also a poem about the movies. So this is the movie. It's a sort of short reconstruction of 2 movies, a short and then a movie about a shipwreck or fire on a ship. There's also the ferroconcrete poem. So these are the most innovative poems in the book because they have no linear order. They're completely spatial, so you can read them in any order you want. So this poem is the Cabaret Zone poem, which is about Moscow nightlife. There's this poem about a private art collector's collection of French Impressionists, Post-Impressionists, and Picasso paintings. This poem is about a circus. So it's actually about one specific circus performance. from 1914. And this poem is about roller skating because it was like the new cool thing in 1914, or one of the new cool things, along with tango. There's a big worldwide tango dance craze. And that's explains some of the book's title. So where did this book come from? So the most important context, of course, is the other books of the Russian Futurists, who by 1914 had already published over 40, many deliberately crude or unconventional in their design and materiality. And they use elements such as wallpaper, burlap, hand-drawn lettering, transfer lithography, rubber stamps, hand coloring, and low-quality paper and collage. So the book on the left is done with transfer lithography, so the artist and author could write and then on a sheet of paper, and then it was transferred by a lithographer. The one on the right has a hand cut out collage element on the cover, along with transfer lithography. So these books were in response to an inversion of the bourgeois literary culture, specifically to the refined publications of the Russian symbolists, luxury art journals, and fine press editions. These publications create an axis of our aesthetic practice focused on the materiality and design of literary publications. And the futurists never questioned the legitimacy or importance of this axis, however far on the opposite side they went. Some books were specific parodies of fine press production, like this one. So it sort of has the gilt on the cover and the sort of floral ornament, but it's on this terrible paper and it's only a few pages long. While others, the relatively crude materiality of the books, took part of the same primitivist aesthetics as the artists they were collaborating with, such as Larionov, Goncharova, and Rozanova. And this book, the image is by Vladimir Berliuk, but it's hand-drawn, so every copy has an original drawing in it, which is kind of crazy if you think about the production. And this context begins to explain some of the design context of Tango with Cows, such as its use of wallpaper in the cut corner, but not its use of experimental typography. But I think, and I can't prove, that one major reason behind this is the visit of F.T. Marinetti to Russia in January and February of that year. In this reading of events, Kamensky, who by that time has read manifestos from Marinetti, but not yet seen Italian futurists' typographic experimentations in La Cerba, is attempting to show up Marinetti by putting into practice what until that point he'd already really theorized about. And so once the decision to use typography in a visual way was made, models would have been all around it. For example, the circus poem is very close in appearance and language to contemporary typographic circus posters, which are shown here, two of which are shown here. There's a lot more to this story, especially the typography, but I'm going to turn to discussing Eugene and I's translation. So here on the one side is a picture of the translation, the other side is the facsimile that accompanies with it. So I don't speak Russian, and so I came to this project because I was intrigued by its visual aspects. I wanted to be able to experience its typography as an inflection of the language, and I wanted to translate the language of the book while replicating the typography, materiality, and design as closely as possible. So for instance, the wallpaper was remade with 5-color screen printing on custom Japanese paper and the Texas printed letterpress. And I was really fortunate that Eugene agreed to be my collaborator on this project. So he's a poet and a translator of the Russian avant-garde. And he's also did an amazing amount of research into Kamensky and the poems, which along with my commentary is contained in like the 300-page commentary volume that accompanies the book. And then here's an overview of the whole project. So there's the facsimile, the translation, the commentary book, and then like a suite of extras that didn't fit into the commentary book. So things that were useful to show, but I wanted to show bigger. And I wanted to recreate the typography as closely as possible. So the first step was to really understand the type used in the original. And to that end, I sorted every single letter form in the book by size and style using Photoshop. So here is the file for Latinish and Latinish bold, and every letter or group of letters is tied to a group, so I can know which pages they come from after I've sorted them. And this is the same file for accent and grotesque. And then I use this to invert the process and make a sort of concordance of every letter form in the book. And then it was easy to do physically, and then I digitized it. So then I could like really identify every single source of every single letter. And this really eased the tasks of finding the sources for the Cyrillic type design. So all the Cyrillic alphabets, except for a couple would type on the cover, were based on Latin originals. So doing this really let me figure out what the Latin sources were, but it also helped me match isolated letters or numbers with their alphabets and to distinguish between lower and uppercase Cyrillic. Because sometimes it's not clear if it's a smaller size capital or a bigger size lowercase. And it also created someone unexpectedly created a vivid mental image of the shop where the book was printed. So the selection of type, essentially one sans serif and one serifed in a range of sizes and styles, plus about 8 decorative display faces. And this is all the type used in Tango. It created this mental picture of a small shop somehow cajoled into printing a technically demanding and outlandish publication. And had it been like somehow mothballed and I walked into it, I don't think I would have been very surprised because I feel like I knew, it was kind of this amazing thing where I kind of felt like I knew what the shop was going to be like. And in fact, later research showed that basically Tango with cows used every single typeface in their shop. And these are some images of other things printed by the same shop. There are 2 pieces of sheet music. And interestingly, there's a lot of ornament. You can see there's tons of ornament, and they didn't use any ornament on there. So that's sort of an interesting thing. And so, but this close-up focus on the type was really essential for creating a translation that felt like it could have been made in 1914. So after I identified these Latin sources in specimen books, I was able to find digital versions, modify existing digital fonts, or create brand new fonts. And for almost all the digital faces, I made up to 7 optical sizes for each font. And this was to capture the subtle but significant variations in design, proportion, and weight of metal type in different sizes. So if you can see, it's, as the type gets bigger, often it gets smaller or narrower. So I wanted to capture that as well. And one of the dangers in using a computer to typeset the book rather than metal type is the monotonous regularity of digital production. So everything would be the same, everything would be exactly parallel, exactly spaced. So to overcome this, I made adjustments for every single word in the book. So I like adjusted the letter spacing, the word spacing, the orientation, if it was like a little crooked on the page. And I also noted every place there was damage and damaged the letter accordingly. So you can see the E from the original has that ding in it. So I took that same ding out of a W, or the O in automobile has a little ding in it. So I took the same O out of the word. So I really wanted it to feel like not digital, but not in a careful way, not in a sort of crude way. And then the last thing is printing the book letterpress really let me recreate the same kind of micro textures of the printing that was in the original. So at the extreme end of this, for the illustrations, I used a laser cutter to thin the paper to 3 different thicknesses, the make ready, so that that some parts of the image would be printed a little weaker, and so you get that same kind of texture that was in the original. So now I'm going to talk about how the book was made. And so this detailed analysis of the type really gave me insight into the atomic typographic units that compose the book. And understanding how they fit together gave me really great insight into the production process. So no documentation really, survived. They weren't really self-consciously archiving anything. But Kamensky must have delivered hand-drawn sketches to the printer, who then interpreted them. He couldn't have set the type himself, like he didn't have the training, and he wouldn't have been able to. And he couldn't have given them a detailed layout that specified the particular typefaces and sizes. And no one was doing that even anywhere until much later. And it's also hard to imagine him working alongside the printer because, first of all, he was on a tour of the provinces in Russia at the time, but also like it just would have been really aggravating for the typesetter. And like, I can't imagine anyone willing to do this project while someone's looking over their shoulder. So the hand-drawn sketches for Tango would have likely looked like these. So these are 2 pieces from the 19-teens of printed matter. The one on the left is for a cover of a book, and the one on the right is for a poster. And so the cover of the book looks like this. So you can see the translation between sketch and printed image. and it's for an autobiography of one of his many somewhat unreliable autobiographies. So the sketches for Tango with Cows may have been more slightly carefully drawn, but probably not much more carefully. But we can reconstruct some of the structure of them through a careful analysis of the physical affordance of the type, letting and rule, combined with my principle of least action, the idea that design decisions simplifying the work of the typesetter were made by him, but any remaining complexity was specified by Kamensky. So we can see this principle at work in the telephone poem. So the top line is 7 fonts of type. They're all 16 points. So the irregular visual appearance of them is solely due to the proportions of the letter forms. Some have tall capitals and short descenders. Some have short descenders or small capitals and long descenders, and others have more typical proportions. But there's no geometric difficulties in it. They're all the same size. It would have been easy to put together. So it seems safe to conclude that typesetter realized a general specification by Kamensky of visual disorder by using the simplest means possible. The most complicated line in the book is below. It's the title line of the poem, Flight of Vasily Kamensky in an Airplane in Warsaw. And he used 38 characters from 19 different fonts of type in 7 sizes, ranging from 8 to 28 points. But if we look at the line, which I've reconstructed here, set in type, we can see the typesetter made his life easier because most of the letters are either at the top or the bottom. So that makes it easier. You only have to fill in the bottom or the top. You don't have to fill in both sides. And this reconstruction lets us really understand the poem if we do so this is a complete reconstruction of the telephone poem. And we can see that typesetters divide the poem into these horizontal bands, and when some of them have subbands. And this method really simplifies the typesetting because each band could be set in a composing stick before being transferred to the form for printing. And in some places, they were able to accommodate a fairly complex layout within the horizontal band, such as in 6, 10, and 12, where there's some kind of nonlinearity happening. It's not clear whether you go across and then down or down and then across. But this was maybe too difficult to do in the middle of the poem. And this, I think, explains that white space that's kind of incongruous in the poem. But it's just due to the typesetter making their life easier and not doing things that were too complex. And so, but we can see some complexities in the poem. So there's in band 7 and 6, there's the daleko, or which means to distant, and it's the letters are getting smaller and smaller. It's always been like a pain to do. Same thing with the descending letters of ulica, which means street. So that it's quite clear to me that was specified Kamensky because the typesetter would have made their life more difficult on purpose. So in the ferroconcrete poems, so here we see Constantinople and Skating Ring again. Constantinople is sort of impressions of his trip to Constantinople. So the influence of the rectilinear nature of letterpress type on the design becomes clear. The horizontality of the other poems can be largely explained by existing typographic conventions and the linear order of their texts. But while these, so there's no linear order, but they might appear to be composed of words freely scattered on the page. They're mostly built from smaller modules of stacked horizontal lines. So you can see that the Skating Ring poem in the second compartment on the top, I think, is a nice. It's still horizontal lines, but it has that sort of nice flow. But there's no diagonal type. There's only one example of the diagonal type in the book in the Cabaret Zone poem. So I think this shows sort of the real influence of the material on the structure. And Kamensky later did hand-drawn visual poems, and by contrast, you can see it's really much more expressive and less constrained. So here's the Cabaret Zone poem, where it has the diagonal type and my reconstruction of it. And so and then all the ferroconcrete poems have these linear elements of rule. And so they perform a structural role in the printing process and not just a visual one, because they separate each band of or space of type, and they make it easier to typeset because you only have to work on one like group at a time, and it doesn't have a lot of influence with the rest of it. And so the physical function of these linear strips of metal, which is maybe metaphorically to rebar, is maybe what led Kamensky to call it ferroconcrete poems. The poems is ferroconcrete. So I don't know, I might be a little ahead of schedule, but I'd like to finish with talking about my approach to the translation. So as I mentioned earlier, I wanted to be able to experience the book as if I knew Russian. So we translated the language, but I tried to reconstruct everything about the book as close as I could to the original. And that wasn't the only option. So I could have tried to translate the visual and material aspects of the book. So if the target context of that translation was a present, I could have used a recently produced floral wallpaper and the default system fonts in the Apple operating system, including, God help me, Pyrus. And using contemporary and inexpensive materials and unpretentious typography would probably recreate better the impression that the original had on its readers in 1914. So people who see this book now always comment how beautiful the wallpaper is, but people in 1914 would have thought it was like cheap and shoddy and garish wallpaper. Same thing with the typeface. Because they're unfamiliar, they seem pleasingly decorative, but in 1914, they would have been very commercial. You would have just seen them in ads and like ephemera and like kind of cheap publications. And so more generally, modern viewers tend to experience the production of Russian Futurist books as rare and precious objects as they are today, rather than how they would have seen it in the present, in their contemporary environment, when they would have seemed more like today's zines, whose Xerox and cut and paste aesthetics signify a more honest directness and authenticity. So it'd be interesting to try to make a zine version of Tango with Cows to recreate that sort of freshness or approach. So I did do a small edition printed on floral wallpaper based on a suggestion by Bill Martin, who also connected me with Eugene. But this wasn't, it was just sort of a fun thing to do. It wasn't really a serious attempt to do a different methodology. And another approach would have been to situate the translation in 1914 America. And this would give the 21st century American reader the same distance in time as a 21st century Russian reader would have the original. So I could have found a small job shop, say in Chicago, figured out what typefaces they had, found the metal type that they had, reset it, printed it on recreated wallpaper from like Sears and Roebuck, or found some vintage wallpaper. And this would have been fun because it would have recreated the process. And it would have been possible because, you know, there's so much type has been saved by people that I probably could find type from 1914 to use in the US, but it just didn't seem what I wanted to do for this project. And the reason is both of these ideas, they have a drawback, and that is that they have a second point of cultural reference that sort of has an arbitrary connection to the original. So for the first approach, if I made things contemporary, it would have those choices would be invisible because they're neutral at the time, but it would quickly age. So, you know, in 20 years, people are like, oh, that's from the 2020s. So it has that danger of aging. And then the second approach, it only really makes sense for a reader from the US or someone who's familiar with American ephemera from 1914, which I guess is probably not very many people in the US either. But my hope is that because my edition is so conservative, so close to the original, that it will free other people to make their own translations that are more maybe experimental like these ideas. And if we allow ourselves the freedom to imagine any target cultural context is valid, just like how we translate Harry Potter into Latin. So we can imagine Tango with Cows from Victorian England, or pre-Petrine Russia, or art directed by Lawrence Stern. And so one example of this is the illustrations by Jacques Carlman of Queneau's Exercises in Style. They're an example of this play across historical visual styles. So on the left, there's a 19th century board game about the autobus, the bus game, and then the right is a 17th century woodcut. They're all illustrating the very short microfiction from the Exercises in Style book, where in the original, the same story is told in many different literary styles. So here, the artist is illustrating it in many different visual styles. So hopefully, maybe some of the audience will take up this challenge to translate Tango with Cows into some other cultural context. And that's all I have. So thank you for coming to my talk, and please feel free to ask questions in the Q&A or send me some emails. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Now I'm going to spotlight Agnieszka.
Okay, hello everybody. I'm trying to share my screen, just a minute. I wanted to show you my slides. Can you see the slides full screen? Yes, literally. Thank you. I'm not that experienced in Zoom, so I just wanted to check. So I wanted to thank the organizers for making it possible for me to speak on one of my fields of study today, which is Shakespeare in contemporary art, with special attention to installation art and artists' books. And my topic today is paper cutting. Paper cutting is used by book artists to address select plays by William Shakespeare. And I will attempt to prove today that cutting into paper and the removal of paper as well, the subtraction of paper, can result in the addition of meaning, because cut up books can and do enter into a creative dialogue with Shakespeare's plays. They can reverberate these plays' major thematic concerns. They can reflect the early modern worldview which informed Shakespearean drama. And they can draw our attention to certain structural features of the plays themselves. And in my work, I try to use early modern concepts as ideas and research tools in the analysis of contemporary art pieces. And before I discuss my examples of artists' books, and I'll be talking about 2 books today, let me just mention some historical concepts, some Elizabethan concepts connected with cutting. And I'm here especially indebted to Adam Smythe's book, Material Text in Early Modern English, published in 2018, where in a chapter on the Renaissance manipulation of the printed book by cutting and pasting, he gives many examples of collage-like books made in the early modern period. And this is true, for instance, of the so-called commonplace books, containing all sorts of useful information which can resemble some of them scrapbooks featuring fragments of printed material, like blocks of texts and illustration. And these fragments come from different sources pasted onto pages, accompanied by handwritten notes. So from a contemporary point of view, the act of cutting up one printed page to fashion another, to make another page, might seem like lack of respect or even an attempt at destruction. However, Smythe's argument is that manipulation, such manipulation, was natural for an age where the text was not solely confined to the form of the book. There were other forms like manuscripts, or inscriptions on the walls. And the book form itself, back then, was not something entirely stable. A few books might, for instance, become part of a larger whole, or blank sheets could be added for the reader's notes written in hand. So this having been said, the scholar, Adam Smythe, he concludes that cutting had more to do with creation of meaning than with destruction. Smith also relates the activity of cutting to one of the most essential categories in Renaissance art theory, namely invention. And I have a quotation here where the scholar says that, and I quote, producing a text by cutting up and reordering existing texts places less stress on the creation of new words and more on the reordering of those already present. Cutting thus recalls the understanding of invention or inventio within Renaissance rhetoric from the Latin invenire, meaning to come upon, to discover, to find, rather than to invent in a more modern sense. End of quotation. So paper cutting seems to be a perfect solution for bookmakers addressing Shakespeare today, not only because it can be related to the notions I've already mentioned, like this artistic, literary creation, invention, but because also those plays themselves, Shakespearean plays, Elizabethan plays, are cut up organisms. And as noted by Bruce R. Smith in his brilliant book, Shakespeare Cut, Rethinking Cutwork in an Age of Destruction, there is an inherent paradox in the early modern play text, which creates the impression of continuity precisely through the use of cuts. So Smith notes the existence of, and I have a quotation here, not just divisions to facilitate performance, speeches and scenes, but also meters, divisions of language into shorter or longer feet. Shakespeare's words may seem to run or flow. He was renowned as honey-tongued in his own time, but paradoxically, it is cuts that create the sense of flow. End of quote. So in the universe of the Shakespearean text, the cut guarantees structural coherence. And this duality, I think, this Shakespeare-specific oscillation between continuity and fragmentation is made visible in Erin K. Schmidt's What's News flag book, inspired by the exchange between Shylock and Tubal in Act 3, Scene 1 of The Merchant of Venice. Despite my limited Zoom skills, I just managed to notice that the artist herself is today here in the audience. So I'm really honored that you're here today. So this text draws its inspiration from an exchange between Shylock and Tubal in Act 3, Scene 1 of The Merchant of Venice. At some point in Shakespeare's play, Shylock, who is a wealthy Jewish moneylender, inquires about his daughter, who is eloped with a Christian, and it's so tragic. It's a tragic scene because he learns about her prodigality. Like for instance, she's traded her mother's engagement ring for a monkey. In What News, the original lines of the Shakespearean dialogue have been cut up and rearranged to create the impression that we have only one speaker talking about a missing girl. The artist herself states that she uses the quiet space of the book, it's a quotation, she uses the quiet space of the book as a means to convey the often unquiet emotional wells in our minds. Her books expose those private thoughts and feelings, both fragile and frantic, which bind us as humans. End of quotation. And within What News, the speaker's state of mind, his or her emotional turmoil is rendered with the help of visual measures. The sign of the speaker's despair is the overall composition of the book. The front side features a pastel drawing of a canal in Venice that was made by the artist herself based on a picture she once took. And the drawing is segmented into multiple flags. The pastel itself, which you can see in the slide, depicts a serene landscape whose elements seem to speak of continuity. We have the bridge, the water. However, as it is cut up into flags, a new and alien rhythm is introduced into what used to be a peaceful scene. So the overall visual effect here can be, I think, related to this paradox, this theoretical paradox I just mentioned, pointed out by Smith, who says that in Shakespeare's dramatic ever, it is the cuts that create the dramatic flaw. So the cut-up structure of What News can actually serve two purposes. It reflects the speaker's turmoil and despair, and it reflects as well the unlikely combination of continuity and discontinuity, the flow and the cut, which is a property of Shakespeare's dramatic ever in general. The visual effect is, I think, intentionally disquieting, and it finds its prolongation in the layout of the text, which in itself has been extracted, cut out from Shakespeare's play, and is to be found on the backs of the flags. The artist says that, and I quote, "the combination of the text and the still image creates an uneasy narrative with little information being offered as to who is lost, who's looking, and why," end of quote. So the impression of confusion, the speaker's confusion, and I think this confusion with which we as readers are supposed to react to the book, already caused by the flag structure of the book, is also highlighted using typographic measures. The artist has used here 2 different colors and fonts for the lines that she's extracted from the play. So some lines are black and in Lucida calligraphy, others white in Arial bold. And this introduction of 2 colors and 2 fonts into a single book, coupled with its segmentation into flags, can be seen, I think, as an attempt to capture something of the emotional turmoil of the book's speaker, which has its root in the emotional turmoil of Shakespeare's speaker, Shylock. And even more fascinatingly for me, the choice of the 2 fonts and colors has a clearly defined structural function. So the artist's intention here was to reflect, using visual measures, typographic measures, a difference of function of speeches in Shakespeare's play. So the black lines in her book stand for asides in Shakespeare, so the short lines spoken to the audience by the players in a theatre, and the white lines stand for soliloquies. And soliloquies in drama, they serve to denote thoughts and emotions that are not externalized within the fictional world of the play, which is also confirmed by the artist when she says that, and I quote, "Sometimes when we are feeling weighed down by a heavy emotional burden, we present outwardly as expressionless despite our inner turmoil," end of quotation. So we have visual measures and typographical measures here used to highlight the structure of the dramatic text and its emotional content, which is really fitting for a book that, as the artist admits, is intended as an homage to Shakespeare. The black and white Lucida and Arial pattern is disrupted intentionally over the final line, loss upon loss, where the color white is here coupled with Lucida and not Arial. And this is how the artist herself explains this choice. The final line, loss upon loss, breaks my rule of font and color, being both white and Lucida calligraphy. I've done this because that line of deep despair behaves both as an aside and a soliloquy. The narrative I've created here of a missing girl and the anguish felt by the person looking for her. So to sum up, this book's very design, its structure, its typography is a tool that is used by the artist to simultaneously reflect the play's emotional content and its structure. And I find this dual function, this dual capacity really impressive. And this double effect is, of course, achieved through cutting, which is, by the way, a very fitting response for Shakespeare's play, because The Merchant of Venice actually revolves around the notion of cutting. Shylock's intention is to cut out a pound of flesh of the Venetian merchant. Antonio, this is an act of revenge, which is supposedly sanctioned by the law, because as we know, in the play, Shylock lends Antonio a large sum of money, and they sign an agreement that says that if Antonio fails to repay the loan, Shylock can claim a pound of his flesh. So cutting into the page is like cutting into flesh, which of course it never happens in The Merchant of Venice. Antonio is left unhurt, but this makes you think of the book as a body, paper as flesh. And this association of the book with the body, paper as flesh, in turn, I think can be referred back to another Elizabethan symbolic concept that has found its way into Shakespeare's oeuvre, namely the body as book metaphor. So in Othello, Desdemona's body is described as this goodly book. In Romeo and Juliet, Paris's face is a book of love, which is supposed to be read, so on and so forth. So people are books in Shakespeare. People's bodies are bookish. A somewhat related point is made by a contemporary book arts educator, Gary Frost, who says that, and I quote, "This primary corporeal nature, both as an analogy to human anatomy as a handheld object, provides a primary descriptor of the physical book." End of quotation. So in the early modern period, cutting was also an indispensable element of reading. So here comes my other concept, like theoretical concept, which can be used in, I think, in the discussion of contemporary artists' books, Shakespeare-related artists' books, which use this strategy of cutting. So in the early modern age, pages in a book needed to be cut open by the first reader. And as Smith reminds us, a buyer, and I quote, would first have had to slit the folds created when a sheet or folio paper was doubled over and creased, then doubled over again and creased. And here comes a really crucial sentence. Uncut, a codex remains an object. Cut, it becomes an event, end of quotation. So in many ways, contemporary artists' books are also events, because they're not just supposed to be touched, they're not just supposed to be handled by the user. They initiate this very intimate contact instead. Now, in material texts in early modern England, Smythe also makes a fascinating point that cutting could actually be thought of, in the early modern context, cutting could actually be thought of as a form of writing, only better, purer, because it leaves the paper unmarred by black ink. And once again, this makes me think of this really haunting line, Othello's line on Desdemona, where he asks this question, was this fair paper, meaning Desdemona, was this fair paper made to write whore upon? So Desdemona is like paper, which is being soiled. So to continue along this vein, paper cutting was believed to be a sister art of embroidery, which in itself was a medium predisposed to tell stories. Cutting also had further bookish connotations, as paper or parchment cutting was a way of decorating books. And the particularly splendid examples shown here in the slide, that's 2 pages from the prior book of Marie de Medici in the collection of the Walters Art Museum, Baltimore. And I have another example here, a page from the so-called Album Amicorum, so a book with inscriptions by the people its owner got to know. And what shows for all this cut work is, once again, inscriptions. So it's a beautiful example, early modern example of this combination of this marriage of words and images. Now, to prove this point, that paper cutting was once seen as a form of writing, Smythe quotes from early modern poetry a poem on a tree cut in paper by a 17th century writer, Edmund Waller, only to arrive at the conclusion that, and I quote, cutting outdoes the pencil or brush by producing a text that has life. The static trees that a painter might create have, when produced by cutting with scissors, the power to bend or shake, end of quotation. So cutting can thus be seen as a form of writing, which results in animation. And this seems to be very much in line with the early modern theory that words, especially words in poetry, have a material presence and a power to animate things, to animate the world. In a way, this is also echoed by the idea of liveness and performativity, which has already been suggested in connection with the artist's book as a medium. Now, the idea of cutting and writing, cutting as writing, informs my other example for this presentation, namely Pat Hodson's She Shift, a work shown at the 2016 Shakespeare Now exhibition in Liverpool Central Library, curated by Simon Ryder. So She Shift takes the form of a screen-like laminated paper cutout. Which is really striking for the way it combines large size, because it's almost 3 meters high, with an impression of lightness. Now, this piece is structured around 2 celebrated passages from Shakespeare's The Tempest, the final speech by Prospero, which starts with the line, "Now my charms are all overthrown," and Ariel's song in Act 1, Scene 5, the famous song, Full Fathom 5. And each of these quotations is inscribed into 12 pages, placed one above the other, making up 2 interconnected columns of text. And our expectations, when we look at a piece like that, our expectations concerning the printed book are here disrupted, subverted, because not only are all the pages displayed simultaneously within this column-like frame, instead of being bound up in a codex, But more strikingly, perhaps, they contain very little paper. And it's on the latter aspect I'd like to focus, because I think that this cutout here serves to reflect some major thematic concerns of Shakespeare's play. Each of the two fragments of the play selected by the artist deals with the topic of transformation. So in his last speech I've just mentioned, Prospero seemingly steps out of the realm of theatrical allusion to address the audience, only to put on another mask, that of a player figure asking to be applauded, asking to be released from the fictional universe of the text. Ariel's song, which you can see presented in the slide, focuses, this is just a stanza, the most famous stanza of the song, focuses on the process of the fossilization of the human body, which, by the way, doesn't really happen in the world of the play. Nobody dies, nobody turns into stones, corals, and pearls. It's just an illusion. However, the processual focus of the passage, the transformative focus of the passage, links it up with Smith's discussion of the cut. So cutting makes the book become an event. The imagery of precious stones, pearls, and coral referred to in one of the passages selected by the artist can be associated with the decorative use of paper cutting in the early modern period. And what you can see here in this slide is a coat of arms that's surrounded by scenes, depictions of scenes taken from the Bible, with this beautifully executed, gilded cutout lettering. However, what is really essential here in C shift is the performative potential of cutting, not so much the decorative potential as the performative potential of cutting. In Shakespeare's English, the verb to cut could also mean to perform, to act, to perform a gesture. It could also mean a display of some striking kind. I'm once again referring here to Bruce R. Smith's discussion of Shakespeare's use of this strategy of cutting. In C shift, Shakespeare's lines are entrapped within an irregular cutout webbing, which is strongly reminiscent of ripples on the surface of water. All the letters are empty spaces in the cutouts, which creates this impression that the lines are, to use another expression from another famous celebrated speech by Prospero, the Revel speech, insubstantial as the lace-like background. However, in a rather paradoxical twist, the words which are delineated by gaps in the paper have their presence highlighted. In the artist's word, and I think it's a nice way of putting things, they erupt through the paper. So words are powerful beings. They erupt through the paper. The intricate system of opening in Hudson's work is a perfect example of what Nola Farman describes as negative space in the artist's book, which arises from accentuated, and I quote, the supporting material, the props, the space between lines of text, end of quotation. So in prioritizing the void, C shift diverges in a significant way from conventional pictorial representations or conventions of pictorial representation in Western art, which prioritize the main subject at the expense of the background. Paper cutting, which involves the subtraction of the material used, is a perfect technique for the creation of negative space. While it differs significantly from the art of painting, which depends on the application of layers of paint onto the canvas, or it approximates other arts, paper cutting, such as, for instance, many of the graphic arts where the design is incised into the matrix, as well as some sculpting techniques. Many graphic arts, in their turn, such as copperplate engraving or woodcut, bear a strong affinity to the art of writing, as they use the line as the primary structural element. Once again, a striking affinity between text and picture comes to the fore, and it comes to the fore in this piece as well. The structural makeup of Hodson's C shift, where emptiness starts to generate meaning, is very much in line with the thematic scope of Shakespeare's The Tempest. Shakespeare was a writer intent on exploring the liminal states associated with theatre making and theatre watching, which he, in his plays, uses as metaphors for life. So he appears to be an ideal conversation partner for a contemporary artist who declares that in her work, she aims to, and I quote from the artist, explore the ideas around the tactile and the illusory. And a parallel palisades of fiction and reality shows in many scenes from The Tempest, starting with the storm itself, the central scene of the play, the mask, and other scenes as well, the speeches I just mentioned. I could find many passages centered on this notion of the opalescence between fiction and reality. There is, for instance, there is very famous line by Prospero, who reflects upon the actors. These are actors, we're all spirits and are melted into air, thin air. So I think that Hodson's piece just reflects these thematic concerns. And let me just end with a quotation by Bruce, from Bruce R. Smith, who states in his book, Shakespeare, the Cat, the significance of a cat can consist in the things cut apart from each other, or in the spaces, created by the act of cutting, or in both. The things cut apart from each other, or the spaces created in the act of cutting. And I think that the two artists' books I've presented today can serve as a wonderful illustration to this observation. And here's my list of works cited. The quotation I used in the title of my presentation today comes from the two gentlemen of Verona. And I also incorporated some fragments of my personal communication with the artists into the speech. So I'm really very grateful to Erin and Pat for sharing their illustrations, pictures of their work, and the artist statements with me for the purposes of the speech. So thank you all for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Agnieszka. And thank you, Daniel and Gretel, for your presentations as well. At this point, we can open a space for Q&As. So you're welcome to drop your questions in the chat if you'd like. And also, if Daniel and Gretel and Agnieszka have questions, please feel free to speak up. I just want to make a comment that it's been really interesting to see three different approaches in this panel today to our prompt of artist books as expanded literacy, and I want to start by this idea of cutting that Agnieszka has brought forward. I think, like, I'd like to ask you, Agnieszka, what you think of this like very material and physical element of cutting, which is also reminds us of editing and having a very, performative action, but also part of the production, how it transfers onto the narrative of the work. So this idea of, like, and this also relates to a little bit to Daniel's presentation, this physical and kind of material action, how it transfers onto the narrative or the literary content of the works themselves.
Well, I don't really I don't tend to think of those books presented or other similar approaches as adaptations of literary texts. I'd say that the Shakespearean text is just one type of material that they use, that the artists use. So I think that this cutting strategies, they give much creative freedom to the artists who are not supposed to recreate the original actions of Shakespeare's or contents of Shakespeare's texts. They can use Shakespeare, and it's book artists and also installation artists that I study who make Shakespeare-inspired works. They can, using these extracted pieces from Shakespeare's plays or poems, because I also studied Shakespeare's sonnets and the way Shakespeare's sonnets are handled by contemporary artists. Using these bits and pieces, using these extracted fragments, they can, and they frequently do, address some pressing notions of today. There is a wonderful artist, Emily Martin, who has made a number of Shakespeare-inspired books. And one of her books is, which I actually discussed in one of my articles, is Desdemona in Her Own Words. And it's made up of many, many parts, even a set of puppets, paper puppets. But one of the essential sections, one of the essential elements of this piece is a collection of word magnets, which are actually all the words spoken by Desdemona in the play. And Desdemona in Othello is presented as this object-like, book-like, what I referred to in my presentation, thing-like human being, devoid of her own voice and devoid of agency. And what the readers or users can do with these words that Emily Martin has extracted from the play is they can rearrange these words and come up with plays of their own, like little playlets. So give voice to Desdemona. And I think this is the kind of cutting strategy which I find most fascinating, the way the artists use Shakespeare's words and the senses generated, some of the senses generated meanings by Shakespeare's plays to come up with their own messages. Full-fledged works of art, which are not adaptations, something entirely different. But I don't know if this answers your question.
Yeah, no, of course, thank you. And I'm just going to read a couple of comments over here. Warren Lehrer says, "Wow, Agnieszka, that was rich. So many great points. I love the focus on cutting and analogies to Shakespeare's approach to cutting in his writing." Also, Caro says, "Wonderful presentation to cut into the depth of a word and visualize it through cutting shift our relationship to the act of cutting and reshapes our relationship to the idea of Shakespeare's meaning." Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for these comments. Thank you.
And I'm going to scroll a little bit back also to read a couple of comments on Daniel's. I love how the deep work of Daniel on the tango and with cows brings forth the activity and presence of the typesetter, not just to the poet, making that work more visible, more readable. Daniel, I would also like to ask about your idea of translated as this kind of expanded archaeological project. You know, like what I mean, you kind of touched through it in the presentation, but I'd love to know a little bit about how you understand this, you know, taking this task where you decided not to be yet to translate a work that is not a language you work in or you primarily understand, and you know, approach all of these elements that are material and physical and visual, and how, was it like the difficulty entailed by not relating to the language, or how that affected your process?
I think one funny thing was how far I got along in the process before I even knew what the poems were. Like, because it's so striking, I was just like, oh, I really want to do this project, but I could have started and like maybe the poems are just really terrible and like boring, and I don't, it's like it was just kind of funny to me at some point where I realized like I had started this project and spent a long time on it before I even quite knew what it was. So that was kind of funny. And I think one thing that I wanted to do with part of what attracted me to the project was this sense of challenge of like trying to get everything, very close. And then that led into this like kind of understanding how it was made. And so I felt it was important to talk about how it was made, because I think often the person who's the famous person gets all the credit for the decisions that are made in projects, when often it has, it's like, why did you make it this big? Well, it's like, well, that size was on sale, or and here, like the typesetter has such a huge role in the project. Like, there's so much that they were making these decisions about that that Kamensky couldn't have even been a part of. Like the roller ring poem, where the kind of cascading words are set in like this kind of nice rhythm that echoes the language, that I think was entirely the work of the typesetter. And you can see that too in when the same poems were retypeset at the same time in a different journal. Like there's very little correspondence except where the words are. So I think, but this archaeology into the poems, no one I don't think would do unless they were doing the translation too. So it was kind of this like side, like a bonus to that work that was needed to do the translation. It's like sort of very finicky as possible.
Thank you. I'm going to read another comment here from Edwin Torres. Thank you all for such engaging and concise presentations. I love the many overlapping connections around the performative action of what it means to be a book. Thanks again. And I'd also like to ask Gretel, or more than asking a question, commenting on one of her questions. What accounts for the persistence of the book in its most traditional form among artists and also among writers who transition into the realm of art? I wonder if it's because it's a device that we, like we all engage since very little, and it's very easy for, everyone to understand its navigation and allows us to explore within it. And I don't know what you think about this.
Yes, sure. What I wanted to notice is like, because these writers that they're really interested in contemporary art, they doing within the book. They don't doing like trying to go and do performance or doing visual elements. I think they believe in the potentiality of what they're doing in fiction. And I like the book is so resilient, and I love books, and I don't want it to change. I don't want to change that materiality and, having the time for like the performance of reading, this moment of slowing down and not just going to art fairs and just passing by the pieces, just the moment of reading as consuming art, being part of art. I know it does. Well, but thank you.
Does anyone else, or does anyone have a comment or a question that they'd like to share? Well, I'd like to thank everyone for being here today. this recording will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, so you'll be able to watch it again afterwards. And thank you very much, Gretel, Daniel, and Agnieszka, for being with us today. And please join our upcoming sessions. So thank you very much and have a great day.